The finest shot is never made by the newest equipment. It is made by the person who understands everything the equipment cannot see. A cool breeze drifted across the Marine Corps rifle range as the first rays of morning sunlight stretched over the distant hills, turning the rows of steel targets into faint silver silhouettes against the desert landscape. Long before the official qualification event began, Marines were already moving across the firing line with practiced efficiency. Rifles rested neatly on shooting mats. Spotting scopes stood beside tripods. Ballistic computers displayed wind corrections in glowing digital numbers, while instructors reviewed scorecards with quiet precision. It was the kind of morning where confidence belonged to technology as much as the shooter behind it. Laughter echoed from one firing position when an elderly man stepped onto the range carrying a carefully protected rifle case that looked older than many of the Marines preparing to compete. William Carter was 81 years old. His posture reflected decades of discipline rather than youth, his silver hair neatly trimmed beneath a faded Marine Corps cap. His movements were unhurried, economical, almost deliberate enough to disappear into the rhythm of the range itself. He greeted the range officer with a polite smile, signed the visitor log, and quietly walked toward an empty bench near the observation line. When he opened the worn rifle case, several nearby Marines instinctively glanced over. Inside rested a beautifully maintained precision rifle whose wood and metal had been cared for with extraordinary attention. Mounted above it was an old fixed power scope with worn adjustment knobs, faded finish, and tiny scratches earned through decades of honest use. Sergeant Tyler Brooks noticed it immediately. He looked from his own state-of-the-art optic back to the aging scope before letting out an amused laugh. "You have got to be kidding me." Several younger Marines followed his gaze. One leaned closer before quietly saying, "That scope belongs in a museum." A ripple of laughter spread across the firing line. Tyler stepped forward with friendly confidence, holding up his own. Modern optic equipped with digital ranging assistance and advanced ballistic compensation. Technology moved on, he said with a grin loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Looks like his scope never did. More laughter followed. William never looked offended. He simply removed a clean microfiber cloth from his pocket and gently wiped the front lens of the old scope with the same care someone might give an old family photograph. His weathered blue eyes studied the glass for a brief moment before carefully placing the cloth back into his pocket. He did not answer the joke. He did not defend the equipment. Instead, he slowly lifted his head and looked beyond the firing line toward the distant hills. The breeze shifted almost imperceptibly. Tall dry grass leaned gently to one side before settling again. Heat had not yet risen from the ground, but faint currents already danced above the rocky terrain. William watched everything in complete silence. Lance Corporal Noah Reed happened to notice that the elderly veteran never once looked toward the electronic wind stations or the digital ballistic displays everyone else depended upon. Instead, he seemed to be reading the landscape itself. Tyler shook his head with another quiet chuckle. "I hope he did not drive all the way out here expecting that antique to compete." William calmly rested one hand on the old scope without taking his eyes off the range. His voice was soft, steady, and almost lost beneath the morning wind. "Good glass helps," he said, "but it has never been the thing that decides where a bullet goes." The laughter faded just enough for several Marines to glance at one another, unsure whether the old man had just answered a joke or quietly challenged everyone on the firing line without raising his voice at all. The quiet challenge hanging in William Carter's final sentence lingered over the firing line longer than anyone expected. Sergeant Tyler Brooks smirked, convinced the elderly visitor was simply holding on to memories that modern equipment had long since surpassed. Around him, Marines continued unpacking rifles fitted with high-magnification optics, laser rangefinders, and advanced ballistic calculators. Digital weather stations displayed wind speed to the 10th of a mile per hour while handheld devices calculated elevation corrections almost instantly. Tyler looked proudly at the compact screen attached beside his rifle. "Everything you need is right here," he said, tapping the display. Range, temperature, humidity, spin drift, even atmospheric pressure. One of the younger Marines nodded in agreement. Hard to miss with all that. William never responded. He carefully rested his old rifle on the shooting mat before removing a small notebook whose leather cover had become smooth from decades of use. There were no batteries, no electronic display, only neatly written notes, faded pencil marks, and carefully folded range sketches accumulated over many years. He opened it for only a few seconds before quietly closing it again without writing a single word. Instead, he stood upright and slowly surveyed the landscape beyond the targets. The distant hills shimmered beneath the strengthening morning sun. Thin strands of dry grass leaned together before returning upright. Dust drifted briefly across a shallow depression nearly 800 yards away before disappearing into still air. William's eyes moved naturally from one subtle detail to another, almost as though the terrain itself was carrying on a conversation only he could hear. Lance Corporal Noah Reed noticed the difference immediately. Every Marine around him seemed focused on glowing screens. William never looked at one. Noah found himself watching the elderly veteran instead of preparing his own rifle. "What is he looking at?" he quietly asked another Marine. The answer came with a shrug, probably remembering how people guessed before computers existed. A few quiet laughs followed. Tyler adjusted the brightness on his optic before walking toward William once more. "You know," he said with easy confidence, "our instructors tell us technology is just another tool." William nodded. "They are right." Tyler smiled. "Then why not use better tools?" William looked toward the distant target line where tiny heat ripples had begun rising from the rocky ground. "Because tools answer questions," he replied calmly. "Experience tells you which question to ask first." Tyler folded his arms, unconvinced. "I trust measurements." William smiled gently. "So do I." He paused before adding, "I simply measure different things." The answer left Tyler briefly silent, though only for a moment. "Well," he finally said with another grin, "today the scoreboards will measure everything that matters." William looked toward the row of steel targets stretching into the distance. "Scoreboards remember numbers," he said quietly. "The wind never does." Noah glanced from William to the digital weather station mounted only a few yards away. The display still showed stable conditions. Yet the small patch of grass William had been watching shifted once again, this time in a slightly different direction than the sensor indicated. Noah frowned. It was a tiny detail, easy to ignore, but the elderly veteran had noticed it before anyone else. For reasons he could not explain, Noah stopped trusting the screen quite as completely as he had only minutes before. The morning sun climbed higher above the rifle range, and with it came the familiar shimmer of heat rising from the dry ground between the firing line and the distant steel targets. Marines continued making final adjustments to their optics while instructors walked slowly behind each position, checking equipment and confirming safety procedures. The atmosphere carried the quiet confidence of well-trained professionals preparing for another ordinary qualification event. Sergeant Tyler Brooks glanced once more at William Carter's rifle before shaking his head with an amused smile. "I have an idea," he called loudly enough for several nearby Marines to hear. "If that old scope is really as good as you seem to think, why not let it prove itself today?" Several Marines looked over with growing curiosity. One laughed softly. "Now that would be interesting." Tyler stepped closer, resting one hand on his modern precision rifle. "There is an exhibition target scheduled before the official qualification begins. Long distance. Same conditions for everyone. Why not take one shot?" William slowly closed the bolt on his rifle before looking calmly toward Tyler. "Whose idea was that?" Tyler smiled. "Mine." William nodded thoughtfully. "Then tell me something first." Tyler folded his arms. "Go ahead." William looked across the valley instead of at the target itself. "Where was the wind measured?" Tyler blinked. "Excuse me." William repeated the question without changing his tone. "Where was the wind measured?" Tyler pointed confidently toward the electronic weather station positioned beside the firing line. "Right there." William's eyes remained fixed on the landscape beyond the steel silhouettes. "That tells you what the wind is doing here." He slowly raised one hand toward the distant hills nearly 1,000 yards away. "What is it doing halfway to the target?" Tyler hesitated for the first time that morning. "The computer accounts for that." William smiled gently. "Does it?" Noah Reed quietly watched the exchange, noticing that William never sounded argumentative. Every answer came as a question that encouraged observation instead of disagreement. The elderly veteran knelt beside his rifle, not to prepare for the shot, but simply to study the terrain through the old scope. He adjusted the elevation turret only 2 careful clicks before lowering the rifle again without looking through it a second time. Tyler frowned. You have not even ranged the target. William looked toward a patch of dry grass, swaying gently halfway down the valley. I already know where it is. Another Marine whispered to Noah. He is guessing. Noah kept watching the distant hillside. A faint ribbon of dust drifted sideways for only a second before disappearing behind scattered rocks. William had noticed it immediately. Tyler had not even looked up from his digital display. Range officers began gathering near the exhibition firing point as word spread that the elderly visitor intended to accept the challenge. Marines quietly drifted closer, some curious, others simply expecting harmless entertainment before the day's official competition. William carefully rested one hand on the worn scope, his fingertips tracing tiny scratches that decades of careful use had never erased. He took one slow breath, looked once more across the valley, and softly said, almost to himself, the range has already told us everything. The question is whether anyone has taken the time to listen. William Carter rested the old rifle across the shooting mat with the practiced ease of someone who had repeated the same careful movements thousands of times. Around him, conversations continued, but they seemed increasingly distant. His attention belonged entirely to the landscape stretching almost 1,000 yards ahead. The dry valley lay beneath the strengthening morning sun, and faint ribbons of shimmering heat began rising from the earth in slow, almost invisible waves. Sergeant Tyler Brooks glanced toward the digital weather station once again before checking the wind data displayed on his ballistic computer. Everything appeared stable. The numbers confirmed exactly what he expected. William, however, never looked at the screen. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his faded shooting jacket and removed the same soft cloth he had used earlier to clean the old scope. He carefully polished the front lens with patient, deliberate movements before pausing. For just a moment, his reflection appeared faintly inside the weathered glass, and with it came a memory carried across more than half a century. He was no longer standing on a modern Marine Corps range. He was a young Marine lying beside an older instructor on a quiet hillside before sunrise. The instructor rested one weathered hand upon the rifle and quietly pointed across the valley toward grass bending in different directions. Never let the glass become your eyes, the instructor had said. The scope only magnifies what your judgment already understands. Young William had nodded without fully appreciating the lesson. The instructor smiled and slowly adjusted the old elevation turret by hand. Good glass helps. Great judgment wins. The wind does not read manuals. Neither should you. The memory faded as naturally as it had appeared. William opened his eyes to the present morning and looked once more across the range. The distant heat shimmer danced differently now than it had only minutes earlier. Dust drifted briefly near a shallow rise before, disappearing behind scattered brush. The electronic weather station continued displaying nearly identical readings. William quietly smiled to himself. He reached toward the worn adjustment knobs of the old scope and turned them with slow, precise movements that produced soft mechanical clicks barely audible beneath the breeze. Lance Corporal Noah Reed watched every motion with growing fascination. Unlike the younger Marines who depended almost entirely on digital calculations, William adjusted nothing in a hurry. Every click seemed connected to something Noah could not yet see. Tyler noticed Noah's attention and laughed quietly. You are studying an antique. Noah answered without looking away from William. I think he is studying something we are not. Tyler shrugged. The target does not care about philosophy. William calmly settled into the prone position, but instead of immediately looking through the scope, he closed his eyes for one slow breath. He listened to the breeze moving across the valley, the distant rustle of dry grass, and the faint rhythm of air flowing through uneven terrain. When he finally opened his eyes again, they carried the quiet confidence of someone who trusted experience more than certainty. Noah felt an unexpected chill despite the growing warmth of the morning. For the first time since the elderly veteran had arrived, he realized the old scope was never the real story. It was simply the last remaining witness to a lifetime spent learning how to see what most people never noticed. The exhibition firing point gradually became the center of attention as more Marines gathered along the observation line. Nobody had been ordered to stop what they were doing. Yet curiosity quietly drew them toward the elderly veteran preparing behind the old rifle. William Carter remained completely unaware of the growing audience. His attention never left the valley stretching beyond the firing line. Every few seconds his eyes shifted from the distant target to the narrow strip of grass halfway across the range, then to a patch of sunlit rocks where faint waves of heated air drifted upward in delicate patterns. Sergeant Tyler Brooks glanced at his digital display one more time before looking back toward William with quiet confidence. "The wind has barely changed," he remarked to the Marines standing beside him. William heard the comment without looking up. "Here," he replied calmly. Tyler frowned. "What do you mean?" William slowly raised one finger toward the middle of the valley. "The wind near us has barely changed." Tyler followed the direction of William's hand, but saw nothing unusual. To him, the landscape appeared still, interrupted only by the occasional movement of dry brush. Lance Corporal Noah Reed, however, narrowed his eyes and continued watching exactly where William had pointed. After several long seconds, he noticed something almost invisible. The shimmering heat above the rocky ground bent ever so slightly in a different direction than it had moments before. A tiny ribbon of dust drifted sideways beneath a low ridge before disappearing. Noah quietly looked back at the electronic weather station. Its numbers remained almost unchanged. William gently adjusted the old elevation turret by a single click and then reached for the windage knob. Another soft click followed. Nothing more. Tyler could not hide his disbelief. "That is all you are changing?" William nodded once. "The valley already made the larger correction for me." Noah looked at him with growing fascination. "You are reading the mirage." William smiled faintly without taking his eyes from the range. "The air speaks before the instruments notice." Noah felt something shift inside his own understanding. Throughout his training, he had learned to trust technology because it delivered reliable information quickly. Watching William, he realized that technology still depended upon someone capable of interpreting the world beyond the screen. The elderly veteran was not ignoring science. He was observing details that no single sensor position beside the firing line could fully capture. Quietly stepping away from the growing crowd, Noah approached Gunnery Sergeant Michael Harris, who was reviewing qualification paperwork nearby. "Gunny," Noah said respectfully, "I think you should come see this." Harris looked up. "What is happening?" Noah hesitated, searching for the right words. "There is an older Marine preparing for the exhibition shot. He is making wind corrections without using any electronic data, and I do not think he is guessing." Gunnery Sergeant Harris raised an eyebrow. "What is his name?" Noah answered immediately. "William Carter." Harris froze for only a heartbeat before his expression subtly changed. The name sounded unexpectedly familiar. Without another question, he reached for his phone, stepped away from the firing line, and quietly dialed a number that very few Marines ever needed to call. While behind him, William remained perfectly still, patiently listening to the valley as though it had not yet finished telling him everything he needed to know. Gunnery Sergeant Michael Harris stepped several yards away from the growing crowd before the call connected. His voice remained calm and professional. "Sir, I apologize for the interruption, but I need to verify something unusual." The officer on the other end answered without hesitation. Harris continued. "An elderly Marine named William Carter is preparing for an exhibition shot on Range 7. For a brief moment, there was only silence. Harris looked back toward the firing line, where William still lay quietly behind the old rifle, his attention fixed entirely upon the distant valley. "Did you say William Carter?" the voice finally asked. "Yes, sir." Another pause followed, noticeably longer this time. "Keep him there if he is willing to stay. Do not rush the exhibition. Major General Robert Callahan needs to hear this immediately." The line ended before Harris could ask another question. He lowered the phone slowly, realizing the simple mention of one name had changed the tone of the conversation entirely. Back on the firing line, Sergeant Tyler Brooks remained unconvinced. He watched William making no further adjustments and quietly smiled towards several Marines standing nearby. "Looks like he has finished guessing." Noah Reed glanced toward Tyler before calmly replying, "I do not think he has guessed anything all morning." Tyler folded his arms. "You really believe an old scope can compete with modern optics?" Noah shook his head. "I think everyone keeps looking at the scope instead of the man behind it. Those words lingered in Tyler's thoughts longer than he expected. William slowly opened the bolt once more, inspected the chamber with quiet routine, and then settled comfortably into position. His breathing remained steady and unhurried. The old scope rested naturally before his eyes, yet he continued spending more time observing the landscape than looking through the glass itself. The breeze shifted again, carrying the faint scent of dry sage across the valley. A small bird crossed above the distant target line before disappearing beyond the hills. The mirage changed direction almost imperceptibly as fresh warmth rose from the rocky ground. William noticed every detail without visible effort. Nearby, Marines began speaking more softly than before. Whatever amusement had filled the range earlier had gradually been replaced by curiosity. Nobody laughed anymore. They simply watched. Several minutes later, the low sound of approaching vehicles echoed across the range. 2 Marine Corps staff vehicles rolled slowly toward the observation area without lights or unnecessary urgency. Instructors turned instinctively toward the access road. Gunnery Sergeant Harris straightened his uniform and walked to meet them. Major General Robert Callahan stepped from the lead vehicle with calm composure. He did not ask about the weather conditions or the scheduled competition. Instead, his first question was simple. "Where is William Carter?" Harris pointed toward the firing line. The general looked across the range and immediately found the elderly Marine lying quietly behind the well-worn rifle. For several silent seconds, he simply watched without speaking. Then he gave one quiet instruction. "Do not interrupt him." Those 4 words spread quickly among the instructors until complete silence settled over the range. Even Sergeant Tyler Brooks found himself lowering his voice without fully understanding why. William remained unaware of the arrival behind him. One hand rested lightly upon the old scope, while his eyes continued reading the distant hills, patiently waiting for the valley itself to offer the single moment he had been expecting all morning. The entire rifle range seemed to hold its breath. Conversations had faded into complete silence after Major General Robert Callahan's quiet instruction. Marines who had been adjusting rifles only moments earlier now stood shoulder to shoulder behind the observation line, their attention fixed on the elderly veteran lying calmly behind a rifle many had dismissed as outdated. William Carter never looked back. He had not noticed the arrival of the general, nor did he appear interested in the growing audience behind him. His focus remained exactly where it had been since sunrise, somewhere beyond the target itself. His breathing slowed until each breath blended naturally with the steady rhythm of the morning breeze. Sergeant Tyler Brooks glanced toward Major General Callahan, expecting an explanation, but the general remained completely silent. His eyes never left William. Noah Reed quietly stepped beside Gunnery Sergeant Michael Harris and whispered, "Sir, why did the general come personally?" Harris answered just as softly, "Because sometimes history walks onto a rifle range without announcing itself." Noah looked back toward William with even greater curiosity. The elderly Marine slightly shifted his left hand beneath the rifle stock before lifting his eyes from the scope for only a moment. Instead of watching the target, he studied the distant heat shimmering above the valley floor. Tiny waves of rising air twisted gently between scattered rocks. Dry grass bent briefly beneath an invisible current before standing upright once more. High above the range, a small hawk circled lazily before drifting farther east. William quietly smiled. Almost imperceptibly, he reached toward the worn windage knob and made one final adjustment. A single soft click echoed beneath the stillness. Sergeant Tyler noticed it immediately. "He changed it again," he whispered. Noah nodded. The mirage changed. Tyler looked toward the electronic weather station mounted beside the firing line. The digital display continued reporting almost identical conditions. "The instruments disagree." Noah answered without taking his eyes off. "William, the valley does not." Major General Callahan slowly folded his arms. Without turning away from the firing line, he spoke quietly enough that only the instructors nearest him could hear. "Do not watch the rifle." They looked at him with puzzled expressions. The general continued, "Watch his timing." William rested his cheek gently against the stock. His finger remained outside the trigger guard while he continued waiting. Several long seconds passed. Nothing happened. The silence itself became part of the lesson. Most shooters prepared themselves to fire as soon as they believed conditions were acceptable. William appeared willing to wait as long as necessary until the range offered exactly the moment he wanted. Another gentle breeze crossed the valley. The shimmering air softened. The patch of dry grass halfway to the target settled almost perfectly still. William slowly inhaled. No one noticed it immediately. "That is it," he whispered without realizing he had spoken aloud. William's finger moved naturally into position. His shoulders remained completely relaxed. Every unnecessary movement disappeared until only quiet concentration remained. Behind him, dozens of Marines unconsciously stopped breathing at the same moment. Major General Callahan watched with the calm expression of someone recognizing a performance he had heard described many times but had never expected to witness in person. William's weathered hand rested lightly against the old scope one final time before all attention narrowed to a single instant that would determine whether experience still possessed something no modern instrument could ever calculate. William Carter remained perfectly still. The valley had finally settled into the brief moment he had been waiting for since sunrise. The faint shimmer above the rocky ground softened. The dry grass halfway to the target stood nearly motionless, and the morning breeze paused just long enough to leave the landscape suspended in quiet balance. Behind the firing line, no one spoke. Major General Robert Callahan watched with folded arms while dozens of Marines stood silently beside him, their attention fixed on the elderly veteran and the weathered rifle resting against his shoulder. William released one slow breath and gently completed the final movement he had prepared with decades of discipline. The sharp report echoed across the valley before rolling back from the distant hills. No celebration followed. William never lifted his head immediately. He simply remained behind the rifle for another heartbeat, quietly observing the range as though confirming something only he could understand. Hundreds of yards away, the steel target answered with a crisp metallic ring that carried clearly through the still morning air. Several Marines instinctively looked toward the electronic scoring display positioned beside the observation shelter. For a brief second, nothing appeared. Then the screen refreshed. A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. One instructor leaned closer to the monitor, believing he had misread the result. Another quickly checked the independent scoring system. The numbers remained exactly the same. Gunnery Sergeant Michael Harris slowly removed his sunglasses and stared at the display without speaking. Sergeant Tyler Brooks looked from the monitor back toward William, then toward his own rifle, unable to reconcile what he was seeing. Noah Reed quietly smiled, not because he had expected the outcome, but because for the first time all morning the result perfectly matched everything the old veteran had been trying to teach without ever giving a lesson. Major General Callahan walked calmly toward the scoring table. He studied the verified data himself before looking toward the range officer. "Confirm it." The range officer performed the required verification procedures with careful precision. Every measurement agreed. Every recording system reported the same outcome. Finally, the officer looked up with unmistakable amazement. "Sir," he said carefully, "the exhibition score exceeds the standing long-range record established 35 years ago." Complete silence followed. Nobody cheered. Nobody applauded. The significance of the moment settled quietly across the range as every Marine realized they had just witnessed something that official scoreboards almost never displayed. William slowly stood, brushed a little dust from one knee, and gently covered the old rifle with its protective cloth before anyone approached him. He never looked toward the scoreboard. He never asked about the result. To him, the shot had ended the moment it left the barrel. Sergeant Tyler finally found his voice. "How?" he whispered, almost to himself. William smiled politely without a trace of pride. The target was never the difficult part. Tyler looked completely confused. William glanced once across the valley where the breeze had already begun changing again. The difficult part was learning when the valley was ready. Major General Callahan continued watching the elderly veteran with quiet admiration. He had seen countless impressive demonstrations throughout his career, but very few had reminded an entire generation that experience could still accomplish what technology alone could never promise. The old scope rested silently atop the rifle, unchanged by the morning, while every Marine now understood that history had never been carried inside the glass, but inside the patient eyes that had looked through it for an entire lifetime. For several long moments, nobody moved. The morning breeze returned to the valley, gently bending the same dry grass William Carter had been watching since sunrise, as though the landscape itself had quietly resumed its conversation after witnessing the shot. Major General Robert Callahan stepped forward until he stood beside the elderly veteran. He looked from the weathered rifle to the old scope resting upon it before smiling with unmistakable respect. "Most people believe they just watched a 35-year record fall," he said calmly. "What they do not realize is that they have just watched the man who originally set it break his own record." A quiet wave of surprise spread through the Marines gathered along the observation line. Sergeant Tyler Brooks stared at William in disbelief. You held the original record?" William gave a modest nod. For a while, Tyler looked toward the old scope, then back at the man standing beside it. "And you kept using the same optic all these years?" William rested one gentle hand upon the worn metal tube. "It never asked to be replaced." A few Marines smiled quietly. Major General Callahan continued. 35 years ago, many of the instructors serving today were still in school. The record everyone has been chasing belonged to this Marine, yet he never returned to remind anyone." William shrugged softly. "Records are temporary. Good habits last much longer." Tyler slowly removed his cap and stepped closer. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier was completely gone. "Sir," he said sincerely, "I laughed at your equipment before I understood who was carrying it. I am sorry." William looked at the young Marine with the same patient kindness he had shown since arriving at the range. "You were looking at the scope," he replied gently. "Most people do." Tyler lowered his eyes. "I thought better technology always meant better shooting." William smiled. "Better technology makes many things easier. It never replaces judgment." Nearby, Lance Corporal Noah Reed quietly closed the ballistic application on his handheld device before slipping it into his pocket. He glanced across the valley one more time, noticing the shifting light, the moving grass, and the distant shimmer of warm air with entirely different eyes than he had only a few hours earlier. Major General Callahan turned toward the assembled Marines. "Remember what happened here today. Equipment matters. Training matters. Innovation matters. But wisdom is earned one careful lesson at a time, and no machine can collect those lessons for you." William carefully lifted the old rifle into its case before fastening the worn latches with quiet familiarity. He never looked back toward the scoreboard displaying the newly verified record. Instead, he looked once across the valley where the morning breeze continued moving through the hills exactly as it always had. As he prepared to leave, Tyler asked one final question. "Sir, after all these years, what made that shot different from the one you made 35 years ago?" William paused, resting one hand lightly upon the old scope before answering with a gentle smile. "Nothing changed about the scope. The valley did not change very much either. The only thing that kept improving was the person willing to keep learning from both." With that, he quietly walked away beneath the bright morning sun while every Marine on the range remained standing in respectful silence, understanding at last that people often remember the equipment because they can see it, but history is always written by the quiet wisdom behind the eyes that know exactly when to trust it.